Mark 1. Conversations at the Speed of Sound.
Put 5,000 feet in here, just as a reminder that you have to level at that height.
Then we've got EPR set.
You're going to use the EPRs as you advance the throttles to make sure both engines are performing normally. So you would dial in here 1.85. Next one.
TACAN.
The TACAN. So the TACAN is a radio navigation aid, and what you'll be setting there is what you expect the outbound heading to be.
Right.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Mach 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. A podcast about all things aviation with a special focus on aviation history. My name is Gary and I'll be your host. Now what you just heard was a demonstration of the pre-taxi checklist for a General Dynamics F111C, formerly in service with the Royal Australian Air Force, now retired of course, and currently on display at the Queensland Air Museum. What you heard was a lucky punter sitting in the left-hand seat of the F111 and a gentleman now retired who flew that very aircraft sitting in the right-hand seat and talking him through the checklist. Do you want to hear a bit more of that? Just a minute or so? Of course you do.
Okay, so bomb nav mode selected knob.
Okay, so that's that one there.
Yep.
Make sure that you've got it in the nav position.
Nav. That's in nav.
All right.
Heading cross check.
What we're doing now is we're going to look at all the various instruments that give you heading and make sure they all correspond to each other.
Ejection handle and center beam safety pins.
All right. So at this stage, you take the two pins out of here and the pins that are up in here. And then, of course, once you've done that, all your ejection system is live. So don't pull anything.
Don't touch any of those.
Chocks out.
Chocks out. Auxiliary brake handle.
Which is that grey one down the bottom to the left. That's it. So you'd push that in. But at the same time, before you do that, you'd put your feet on the brakes.
Right.
Can you feel them?
Yep, I can.
All right, so we push the toes down before you push that in. So you push that in.
Yep.
And now what's stopping the aircraft rolling are the brakes that you've got your feet on. Okay?
So now I've got nose wheel steering.
So you now need to engage the nose wheel steering. So you would push this button here.
Now I have to make something really, really clear. This is important. At the time of recording, you are not able to come into the Queensland Air Museum and have the kind of experience you heard just now. In fact, it is a rare treat to have the cockpit of the F111 open, and with COVID restrictions, we are currently not able to invite visitors into the confined spaces of our aircraft. So I don't want to mislead you. Just for now, you can have a guided walk around of the F111 and all of our aircraft, but as you'll hear in my conversation that's just coming up, we have a very special F111 experience in the planning phase, which will be available very soon. And in that experience, you will be able to sit in the cockpit with a former pilot and go through a checklist and more. We'll explain a bit more about that in our conversation that you'll hear in a moment. But because this is the first episode, let me just introduce you to what we're doing here. In this episode, we're going to do what we hope to do every month or so in these podcasts, and that is to meet one of the Queensland Air Museum tour guides. And let me tell you, these people are a fascinating bunch. Some people, when they visit us at the museum, they prefer to just make their own way around the 6 acres of aircraft and exhibits, and that's great. Others appreciate the fact that there are almost always a couple of guides around the place to answer their questions and generally make sure that they get the most from their visit here. We currently have 18 trained volunteer guides, and each one of them brings a unique aviation perspective. Today you're going to meet Royal Australian Air Force Air Vice-Marshal retired Dave Dunlop, who volunteers as a guide a couple of days each week. And if you don't know, an Air Vice-Marshal in the RAAF is the equivalent of a 2-star general. Dave is an excellent bloke, an all-round gentleman, and I was delighted to talk with him. So right now, this is me talking with Dave Dunlop. So I'm here in Hangar 1 at the Queensland Air Museum. We're standing just under the F-111C, and I'm standing with a gentleman who actually flew this very aircraft. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you, Dave, for talking to me. This is retired Air Vice-Marshal Dave Dunlop, RAAF. Dave, you've had a lot of experience flying. How long have you been flying aircraft?
Well, I was very fortunate to learn to fly as a 16-year-old. And I did that as a Air Training Corps cadet. So my high school, had a flight of what was then called the Air Training Corps, which had been established by the Air Force in World War II to give enlistment training to young males. So through that process, or through the cadet organisation, there were 6 flying scholarships awarded each year to people in southeast Queensland. So I went through the process and was selected for one of those flying scholarships. So very fortunate to start as a 16-year-old.
That's a great way to start. So you were born in Queensland, grew up in Queensland?
Yes, so I was born in Brisbane and grew up here. Went to school at Yeronga, then in high school in Brisbane, and joined the cadets.
And I guess the fact that you joined the cadets gives us the idea that you always wanted to fly. Is that the way it was?
Not necessarily. I suppose like most young boys of that period, growing up in the 1950s and 60s, aircraft was something that you all were interested in. But we had a family friend who was about 5 years older than me, who was learning to fly, and I suppose having him around and chatting to him, and he did stay with us as a boarder for about 6 months, and I guess during that period he explained to me what he was doing in learning to fly at Royal Queensland Aero Club, and that probably influenced my decision to join the Air Force cadets rather than the Army cadets. These scholarships for the Air Training Corps cadets were locally based, so the 6 of us in that particular year did our flying training with Royal Queensland Aero Club out at Archerfield. So the Air Force paid Royal Queensland Aero Club for the flying that we did, and then they took us through the whole process. It was rather significant because we at the end of it, we'd done about 80 hours of flying, and we had what was then called the unrestricted private pilot's license.
And did that give you some kind of entry into the RAAF automatically, or how did you transition from there?
No, it didn't. I suppose the Air Force was trying to, by using this flying scholarship scheme, to influence people to join the Air Force. And for, I think, 3 of our 6, we did join the Air Force. But you then joined and went through the normal process. In my case, I joined and went to the Air Force Academy at Point Cook, where we did a science degree with Melbourne University and some flying. But at the end of that, we then went and did a normal pilot's course with the Air Force.
Okay, so before we get there, you're learning to fly, you're doing your 80 hours at the Aero Club. What are you flying?
Well, at that time, the Victor Air Tourer had been introduced to flying organisations around Australia. So Royal Queensland had a number of those, and so we all learnt on the Victor Airtura, as well as Cessna 150s and Cessna 172s. 172s mainly for our navigation phase. My instructor was a former World War II Lancaster pilot by the name of Gus Day, who's a bit of a legend at Royal Queensland Aero Club. And he would take the three of us that were in his charge, the three Air Force cadets or Air Training Corps cadets, on cross countries. One person would be up the front with him doing the actual flying and the navigation, and then we'd land and swap. And that way all three of us were getting the experience, and it was 3 times the experience for the cost for one. So very clever the way he did it. I would say he was very firm but fair and a very good instructor.
And did you know straight away, when you got into the air, that this was for you?
I think so. A lot of people talk about catching the aviation bug. Various people have got other names for it. But basically you spend a lot of money learning to fly, perhaps. I was fortunate the Air Force spent a lot of money trying to capture me, which they did. And once you've got that aviation or flying bug, you tend to have it all your life.
How many years now have you been flying?
I suppose I started in 1965, and my last flight with the Air Force was in 2001. And since then I haven't actively continued flying, but I have gone and done some significant birthday gifts, flying tiger moths and things like that.
Birthday gifts, how does that work?
Well, I suppose having an hour and a tiger moth, perhaps for your 60th or your 70th birthday, is quite a treat, and also brings back a lot of memories. Tiger moths, I never learnt to fly in a tiger moth. I might add that Royal Queensland, when we were flying Victor Tours, still had a couple of tiger moths, but they were more for the enthusiasts as opposed for a main training aircraft. They'd moved on from the tiger moths by then.
Okay, so all of those years in the Air Force, what did you first fly in the Air Force?
But when I was at Point Cook, I flew the Wingill. The Wingill at that stage was the basic trainer for the Air Force. The Mackie was being introduced to replace the two-seat Vampire as the jet trainer. But at the same time, the Air Force looked at their training system and adopted what was then called all-through jet training. The idea was you'd do minimum number of hours on, in this case, the Wingill, about 20, and then you'd do the rest of your pilot's course flying Mackies at Pearce in Western Australia. So I was on one of those early courses. So most of my pilot's course was flying Mackies at Pearce in Western Australia.
Now, I'm a complete civilian, Dave, not just because I haven't been in uniform, but because I come at aviation with an interest rather than experience. So I'm speaking, completely as a novice here. Can you describe, is there a difference in the way you experience flying a jet to a propeller aircraft? Obviously it's faster, but in what other ways would you describe that it's different?
The process, obviously, the physical way that you start a jet and use it is different. But the overall way you would, especially in a training environment, it's the same processes that you're using, just a different vehicle. And in this case, the Mackie had a Rolls-Royce Viper in it, which was a very robust and forgiving engine. The Air Force at the time saw the future as jet, not propellers, hence why they went to this all-through jet. Jet is much simpler to use. If you look at a piston engine advanced aircraft with a variable speed prop, and etc., etc. It's quite complex to keep all that under control, whereas the jet is much simpler. It's got one lever, slow and fast. And especially when you get to something like an F-111 or a Mirage, very simple, whereas a much more complex aircraft with propellers or gas turbines driving a propeller, there's a lot more to deal with.
And you would have graduated up from the Mackeys, to a Mirage?
Yes. So off pilot's course, you're then streamed to various aircraft types. In my case, with a few of my classmates, we went to Mirages. So we got posted from Pearce to Williamtown, just north of Newcastle in New South Wales. And there you do in our case, a fighter leading course on Mackeys. But you are taught all the basic fighter skills on the Mackie before you progress to the Mirage, noting that that was a fairly big step from a Mackie to a Mirage.
And fighter skills, I guess, are the obvious things. When you're engaged in combat with somebody who's trying to shoot you down, there are things you have to learn that go way beyond just mere aviation.
That's correct. So besides, we'd learned to fly the Mackie, but you will learn tactical formation flying, air-to-air combat, air-to-air gunnery, but also because the Mirage had two roles, air-to-air and air-to-ground. So on the Mackie we also were taught how to use the aircraft to attack targets on the ground. So that was part of the fighter lead-in course. You went through the whole process, and then at the end of that you went to a Mirage conversion course.
So tell us what a strike pilot means.
When we introduced the F-111 into service, it really replaced the Canberra. That was our first jet bomber. And the bomber came out of World War II, the Lancasters Bomber Command. We replaced, in Australia, we replaced the Lancaster with the Lincoln, and from there to the Canberra. Fairly large step, as it was for most air forces. The F-111 was another huge step in that stream, in that the aircraft itself could outrun a fighter. But it wasn't a fighter, it couldn't turn. So I suppose the term strike brought together that it was a bomber, but it could go as fast as a fighter, and therefore could strike, in the F-111's case, at night, at very high speed.
So I'll just make mention of the fact that you've referred to a number of aircraft now that are here at the Queensland Air Museum. We have examples of them on display, and they are the stars of the show here. Obviously, the aircraft. So you've mentioned the Wingeal. We've got a Mackie. You've talked about the Mirage and the F-111. We have a Canberra as well.
Yes. But I also flew quite a few variants of the F-111 over the years. I was fortunate to do an exchange tour with the United States Air Force at a place called Mountain Home in Idaho, which I might add is nowhere near the mountains and in the middle of the desert. And so there I was fortunate to fly the last variant of the F-111 called the F-111F, which really was, because it was the last development, it was a digital aircraft rather than analog. It had the upgraded engines, it had upgraded systems, so it really was, if you like, the Rolls-Royce version of the F-111.
Now we have an F-111C here at the Air Museum. Let's come to the Air Museum now. There are so many stories about your flying career that I would like to explore, so can we do that again? We can come back and talk more. But just for this episode, we just wanted to meet you and be introduced to you. I did want to mention that you've reached the level of Air Vice-Marshal, and I think I said that at the beginning. Is it 2 stars?
2 stars.
2-star General, yes. So you are a tour guide here at the QAM. How long have you been involved here with the museum?
I suppose I became involved at Queensland Air Museum when they were getting the F-111. There were 6 of the F-111s when they retired, after they retired in 2010, that went to private museums, 5 in Australia and the other one in Hawaii. QAM had been trying to get one of those for some time. Behind the scenes, there were many people who were supporting them. Once it arrived here, then I helped with showing people the aircraft at open cockpit weekends, and then as the tour guides situation developed to where we have most days 1 or 2 tour guides here at the museum to show people around, that really led to spending, I suppose, more time here at QAM. I might add most of us also behind the scenes do quite a few other things to help the museum. And at present, the present project for Peter Growder, who's Air Commodore retired, and he and I used to fly together in this particular aircraft over many years, is to put together what we are calling the ultimate F-111 experience.
Oh, now tell us about that.
More to come on that shortly.
Okay, well, without too many details, are you able to tell us anything about that?
Well, we do have people who come and would like to spend more time and know more about the aircraft. So we saw this as an opportunity to perhaps do a more detailed visit, lasting 1.5 to 2 hours, where we'll not just talk about the history of the aircraft, its development, its use in Australia, and why did Australia buy it in the first place, but also look at its features that were first of, the swing wing, the afterburning turbofan, etc. We'll go into more details about those and some of the science and history behind them. But also we're going to get our visitors to sit down and plan a full mission, which we would have done if we were doing a strike using the F-111 in the Air Force 10, 15 years ago.
Wow, so it's a kind of a hands-on experience.
And then we'll sit them in the cockpit, get them to do some checklists, talk about the mission itself, and then of course, like every mission, afterwards you have to have the debrief. So either they can debrief us or we can debrief them, or perhaps it will be a bit of mutual debriefing. And of course, if that was over a beer afterwards, that'd be even better, wouldn't it?
And this is for small groups of people?
At this stage, we're looking at a maximum of 2. We really want it to be one-on-one. And we think that a larger group then, for us as guides, means that what do you do with the other, let's say if it was a group of 4, what do you do with the other 3 when you're sitting in the cockpit? So I think we'll stick to 2, and it's certainly that's what we plan to do initially, and we'll see how that goes and develop from there.
So watch out for that coming in 2022, the ultimate F-111 experience. Keep an eye on the QAM website and on our Facebook page for information about that, and we would love to give you the opportunity to join in with that as well. Dave, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. What days are you here normally as a guide?
Normally I'm here on Mondays and of late Saturdays, sometimes Wednesdays as well. It all really depends on if we've got tours coming, then we juggle ourselves to have the right people for the tour, but most of us sort of stick to for me it's Mondays and Saturdays.
And when somebody comes into the Air Museum, if you're here guiding, you don't just focus on the F-111, you take them around the entire collection.
Most of our guides have acquired a lot more information about the other exhibits. We're lucky in that some of the guides have flown other aircraft, and so we all listen in on what they've said and get a few stories from them. So one of our guides has actually flown the Gannet, for instance, and crashed it into the sea and managed to survive its sinking. So we can tell those stories.
I think it's still somewhere in the South China Sea, is that right?
It is, yes. But some of our other aircraft, like the Ventura, which is the restored World War II anti-submarine aircraft, there's a lot of stories there which we've got from the people who've been at the museum for a long time. But also it's surprising that some of our visitors often say, well, I've flown that aircraft. So it's an opportunity to ask them questions. I had a gentleman here last week who had flown MiG-15s and MiG-17s as a test pilot with the Polish Air Force.
Wow.
So we have a MiG-15, and we went down there and he talked to me for about half an hour about that aircraft. So now I'm an instant expert on MiG-15s.
But all jokes aside, I'm sure there are things that you're constantly learning and hearing about for the first time as well.
That's true. And I suppose what we try to do is to go and do more research for each of the aircraft and then share that with our other guides. So we've now got an interesting cross-section of people who are guides. Most of them are aircrew, but also engineers. And so I suppose we feed on each other and get lots of information.
So we have one or two guides normally on duty here every day that the museum is open, and the museum is going to be open in 2022 every day except Christmas Day and Good Friday, I believe. So if somebody was to come in here, they can be sure that they will find a guide around the place who can answer their questions and talk to them if they like. Otherwise, they're very welcome to just wander around here and take their own time, and many people do that too. But it's the kind of place where you do get to meet, as you say, people you didn't expect to meet, people whose stories you've never heard, people who share a common interest and love for aviation, and whether it's military or civilian. And it's a wonderful place. So we'd love to see you join us here in Hangar 1 at some point, and either meet Dave or one of our other guides and have a look at our F-111 amongst the almost 100 aircraft we have here on display, as well as engines. And so look out for the advertising about the F-111 experience coming up in 2022. I would love to talk to you more, Dave, because I feel like we've really only scratched the surface. So can we talk again?
We surely can.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me today, and we will talk again.
Thank you.
So that was my very brief conversation with Dave. There will be more to come. Dave and others here have a lot of stories to share, and we're going to collect those together as an audio archive of aviation heritage. We're going to store those here as part of the QAM collection, and we're going to make sure that they are available to you to listen to and to learn from and enjoy. We're going to be bringing you interviews and conversations with pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers, civil aviation cabin crew, and we also want to hear from you. Shoot us an email at QAMMach1, that's O-N-E for one, QAMMach1 at gmail.com, or have a look for the discussion group on Facebook. On Facebook, just search for the Mach 1 Hangar and join the group. The Facebook group is also where we'll have photos and maybe videos of the people we speak with and the aircraft or aero engines or whatever it is we are discussing for that episode. So that's the Mach 1 Hangar on Facebook. So that's our first episode. Thank you for putting us in your ears. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you get yours, and we will do our best to bring you a new episode every week or so. I'm Gary, and this has been Mach 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. Come and see us soon.